focus of my talk is really the disconnect between kind of what you're expected to believe in really modern upper middle class life, not just academia, and reality. And I talk about everything from perceptions of Native Americans as very peaceful across the great warrior tribes to some of the claims made by Black Lives Matter and by the alt-right in response today. Just things that everyone's heard, but that are completely untrue. Why does that happen? What's the root there?
Welcome again to the Wednesday Speaker Series. Thank you so much for all of you for making such an effort to be out here. We are on a real tear here of fantastic speakers who bring us closer to our stated mission of the fearless pursuit of truth. And we are going to look at that from a different angle again this week with our wonderful guest speaker, who's been in the house and has already spent some time with some of you in close discussion, which is fantastic. Thank you very much for doing that, sir. It strikes me when I was gathering my introduction for today that the term hate crime is part of the lexicon of political language for you all growing up. Maybe when you were in high school, this is a term that you would have become very familiar with, but it was almost completely absent from mine. And it may be that my parents, my grandparents, maybe that was a term indeed that they did actually grapple with. But I know it was not something that ever kind of raised its head while I was at school 2 decades ago. So in service of the pursuit of truth, I visited a website named USA Facts. Presume that's where I learned facts about America, not being American. And it told me that reported hate crimes have risen 108% over the last 9 years, from a low of 5,597 in 2014 to 11,643 in 2022. This seems extreme, so I checked it with an even more trusted source, the FBI. And the FBI tells us that indeed there has been a massive increase in hate crimes. The FBI tells us that the data reveals hate crime incidents are indeed increasing year on year. And maybe it's a good thing that our speaker for today has investigated the idea of rising hate crimes extensively. Not just hate crimes, investigated a whole number of things that have entered popular debate today, but still pose us with great difficulties in discerning what the truth of the matter actually is. And I suspect that maybe once trusted sources are not actually so trusted anymore, whether that be institutions or perhaps, and maybe this is something our speaker will get into, individuals, people given roles in society as truth tellers. Of course, that person is Wilfred Reilly, who joins us today from Kentucky, and our great dean of the Center for Economics, Politics and History, who himself is a habitual truth teller, is going to come and say a few words to give a more fulsome welcome to Professor Reilly. Would you welcome Dean Morgan Marietta?
When I talk to you like this, I often take the opportunity to remind you that people are lying to you. And I am thrilled today to have someone with us who will back me up on that. Today we had Wilfred Reilly, one of the great public intellectuals of the current day. I think whenever we have a speaker in, especially on a Wednesday like this for the whole university, you should ask yourself the question of why. Why that one? Why that person? I could have asked a lot of people. Why him? He was the top of my list of people I wanted to invite in to speak to the students. And you should always ask why. Just like when Patrick Deneen was here last week. And let me say something about a comparison of the two and why you're fortunate to see them in a row. Patrick Deneen is one of the great classical scholars. He was speaking about high theory. Today, you're going to see high empiricism, which is the partner of that. It's the great ideas combined with the look at evidence that actually takes you where you want to go. You recall from last week's discussion, What Professor Deneen was telling you was that the Odyssey is not just a great adventure story, it's about the seeking of knowledge. What Odysseus really wanted was knowledge. He was offered these deals about what knowledge would cost him. And in the current day, knowledge is especially difficult to find. And the cost you will pay, not just for finding it, but for speaking it, is excessively high. And that's the combination of what you saw last week about high theory and this week about high empiricism. And if you can do both, now you will be doing what UATX was designed to actually do. What Professor Reilly is known for is courageous empiricism. He has this great phrase, which I have stolen, the most sincere form of flattery, and use a lot, that he says that in the current day, you are told you have a duty to pretend, a duty to pretend that the things that are socially acceptable are true, even though you know they're not. But you have a duty to pretend. You do not have such a duty. You have an obligation to observe. I was talking to my son, Mason, who's 7. He wanted to know about Lord of the Flies, which, as you know, is this spectacular novel by William Golding. And you may not know that Golding, in his early years, was a liberal. And then he fought in World War II, which made him a conservative. And he struggled the rest of his life trying to reconcile what he thought of humans from different ideological perspectives. And there's this great essay of his called The Hot Gates, where he's looking at old battles, and he's asking himself, what happened on these battlefields? And he has this great phrase in this essay, that we have the duty and the necessity of trying to understand. The duty and the necessity of trying to understand. And that is what I think we actually have. Will Reilly has written 3 fascinating books. He was first well known for Hate Crime Hoax. He wrote Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. And then he wrote Lies My Teacher Taught Me. Great, great book. All are attempts to understand things that people in the current world wish you to not understand. He's written popular articles now in the triple digits at Commentary, Newsweek, Academic Questions, Quillette, National Review, Law and Liberty, Ms. Magazine, Tablet, City Journal, PragerU. He has a particular talent, a knack, for explaining important empirical topics to a popular audience. And that is what he's going to be talking about today, the courageous empiricism that UATX was founded to follow. Let me end here with a word about university mottos and truth. You all know that the motto of Harvard is Veritas. I was an undergraduate at the University of Pittsburgh, and we used to joke that the Pittsburgh motto was Veritas et Virtus, truth and virtue, which made us one step better than the Harvard undergrads because we also cared about virtue as well as truth. You surely know that both are lacking on college campuses in the current day. They're lacking truth because they're lacking courage. They have not the courage to actually look at evidence that people don't want them to look at. They have neither one. You've also heard me talk about James Madison's personal motto, Veritas non verba magistri, the truth, not the word of the teacher. Don't trust what is told you simply because someone has said it. Investigate the evidence for yourself, as he does, as you should do. I propose that as the motto for UATX. Veritas non verba magistri, the truth, not the word of the teacher. Imagine if we adopted it as ours. It would be the most intellectually humble motto of every university in America, the one that encourages you to question not just the truth, but the teachers themselves, the institution itself, to challenge us, even the teacher, especially the teacher. The skills you will learn doing that are the ones Professor Reilly is going to talk about today. Know how to seek empirical evidence, know how to interrogate that empirical evidence, and have the courage to speak it and let the chips fall as they do. That takes courage, and that is why Wilfred Reilly is here. Professor Reilly.
Hello.
All right, how are you guys? Yeah, good to hear. So I'm Will Reilly. I hope I don't disappoint after the introductions. Always a worry at some level as a speaker. But I'm an associate professor of politics at Kentucky State University, a historically black college located in the Kentucky State Capitol, and am the author by now of, as was noted, a couple of books. I wrote the book Hate, Crime, Hoax. I wrote a book called Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. And I most recently wrote the book Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, a response to an older book simply titled Lies My Teacher Told Me, which I think updated it a bit for a new and rather different era. So I'm very happy to be here. I love the U Austin model, hope to return at some point in the future. And my topic today is something that's sort of a through line across all of my books, which is the extraordinary disconnect between reality and what it is politely conventional to believe in modern academia and also in sort of upper middle class life more broadly. So in an era where a very real survey question, this is from GADSAT in 2021, is, forgive me, do you believe that some women have 9-inch penises? I believe with reason, and you can answer that yes or no, these are anonymous, but I believe with reason that this disconnect, this gap, may be larger than it has been at any time since the era of essentially mandatory religion came to an end. So in my Lies book, a core theme is that the average educated person is constantly told basically two things by people in positions of intellectual power, by secondary educators, by professors and dons like myself, by television news readers, and similar critters. The first is that society is essentially dominated by the political right, and that these, how would you say this, these pro-social members of dominant groups present our society and our history in an unfairly positive light. I think this is fairly non-controversial if you take 30 seconds to analyze the idea. We hear constantly about white supremacy and the trickiness of the patriarchy, and at least until a couple years ago, about the importance of getting woke to the story that you're being fed. So theme one in society, at least when I read through the academic journals and so on, is that a particular group of very conventional people control the narrative that you hear and are telling you lies, in essence. The second common theme is that this, what I just described, this constant positive message from the right is all untrue, and that we Westerners might very well have the worst civilization ever. We kept slaves. We oppressed women to a unique degree. We dropped huge sun bombs on innocent people of color to end a war. How often have you heard that the two real pillars that the United States is built upon are slavery and genocide? I'm having fun and puffing a very, very small amount, but this is all very conventional modern content. It's Ibram Kendi, Rich Delgado, the 1619 Project, Howard Zinn's People's Histories of the United States, and more. Old school boss men, goes the narrative, still run our white supremacist, patriarchal, post-colonial, homophobic, transphobic, demiphobic, speciesist society. And almost the real goal of a college education, I was told this myself as a young African-American and Native man, almost the real goal of a college education is learning about their untruths and about how oppressed you are, in whatever unique way you may be oppressed. That varies from person to person. But in reality, researching at least my latest two books, what I found is that almost the exact opposite of this narrative is more accurate. That's not to say there aren't power relations in society, but the people presenting themselves as edgy resistors have in fact been in charge of many of our major social institutions for decades. And the content inside many of those institutions comes from them. At present, the center left of the Democratic Party controls the American White House. Every book that I just mentioned above, the new 1619 volume, Everything by Dr. Zinn, the original Lies My Teacher Told Me, is used in the schools as a textbook. In fact, a large part of writing my latest book, to break from the script, was reading 20 high school textbooks. Fascinating exercise that many of you have probably just gotten past. But 1619 and the Zinn Education Project, in fact, offer entire curricula for your school. So in our field of academia, or the field of academia shared by all three introducers and speakers here, the professoriate leans between 84% and 93% to the left politically. There's some dispute about the best way to count and track political contributions and that kind of thing. But if we look at just straight political party membership, as a co-author of mine, Bob Moranto, did last year, the academic departments vary between economics, which is the friendliest to Republicans at 4.5 Democrats to 1 pachyderm. So that's over here. And sociology, where the ratio is 43.8 to 1. I'm not sure whether I'd put this on the serious fields list, but in communications, the breakdown is currently 108 to 0. So there weren't enough conservatives at top 300 universities to break over 0.5% and be counted. And the things that the actual thought leaders of today are telling people, and the first thing I find, again, is that these people don't look necessarily much like what we're told they do. The things the actual thought leaders of today are telling people don't seem to be notably more true than sort of the jingoistic content of the past. So the book I just mentioned is obviously devoted to empirically breaking that down. And there are quite a few examples given. But since this is Columbus Week, I thought it might be interesting to start with Chapter 3, Lie the Third, Native Americans Spent All Day in Peaceful Dancing. So again, this is an actual thing that humans with mouths pretty much say. I was able to obtain, as part of the research process for the book, and shout out to Jane Lingle, the research associate that helped with that work, but I was able to obtain the official US government curriculum on Native Americans, and it reads a bit like the speech about how every single rock has a name from the Disney movie Pocahontas. To quote, one actual passage reads, "There was a love of every form of life. The Native Americans did not kill anything they could not use. They never killed an animal or a fish for the sport of it. Native Americans lived in harmony with nature and did not abuse the natural world. They were ecologists long before the word was ever used and in a better wise." Another passage argues that there is a fairly universal and wonderful Native American value system that existed prior to 1492. Some components of it allegedly were, these are all quotes from the document, respect for one's fellow man, no major wars, no poor and no rich, and no jails, taxes, borders, or boundaries. Imagine. This is a pretty typical take on the first of the topics we're going to talk about, but History Central, the major sort of secondary educational website, also contains a lot of material about the original inhabitants of the United States of America. They say most Native Americans had no need to farm. Again, a direct quote. Food and other resources all but fell from the sky. The land was full of animals. The sea was full of fish. Wood was plentiful, and so on. Most people have heard some version of this take and basically believe it. So the libertarian think tank, the Skeptic Research Center, recently asked just a number of Americans, white and black sample primarily, how they feel about Native American Indians. And they found that 71.2% of people believe that, quote, the Native American tribes lived in peace and harmony until the white man came. Obviously, the reveal here is that the entire "we Westerners conquered paradise" take is simply BS to a rather striking degree. On the sort of more real academia front, scholars writing for the journal American Antiquity and the website Science 2.0 just confirmed that the most violent time in North American history was before any whites got here. So looking at the Southwest around the time of the fall of the Anasazi, one of the great native nations historically, they note that about 90% of all male bodies showed signs of death by warfare or murder. Head trauma, broken forearms as you try to defend yourself, etc. One area that was studied went from a population of 40,000, 43,000 to a population of none over a period of about 30 years. And this is pretty typical for what used to be called savage life, by the way. Until the 1960s, about 55% of Yanomamo men, a free tribe that still exists in South America, died in violent duels or raids. So one suspects, of course, that what happened to women who were captured in this violence was no better. So life was fairly cold and short before Christianity or modern science or feminism. I'm not going to go on all day about Native Americans. There are actually multiple topics for me to complain about and review. But obviously the great southwestern native tribes were not alone. The Aztecs in modern Mexico have become a bit legendary, but it's worth going into why. Aztec society was structured to what we would consider a bizarre degree around the worship of a bloodthirsty pantheon of war gods and the human sacrifice that went along with this. So the long-running flower wars between the Aztecs, or the Mexica, and civilized neighbors like the Chiluans were fought largely to get captives who were sacrificed in numbers of up to 20,000 to dedicate temples and the like. They were also eaten. We all know this at some level, but it now appears that the Aztecs ate so many people that it actually affected their diet. So per Bernard Ortiz de Montellano, pretty obviously not someone who hates Hispanics or New World Indians, Aztec cannibalism satisfied up to 7% of all need for protein inside at least the Aztec capital, the city of Tenochtitlan. This is apparently considered a low-end figure, by the way. Things weren't any nicer anywhere else, not just in Native America, but we could go into the Sioux and Tonkawa and Comanche and so on pretty easily. But all of this obviously contributed to warfare between Native peoples and the incoming Americans, many of whom, by the way, Scotsmen, Irishmen, captured black West Africans, and so on, weren't significantly less warlike. We often hear that the USA broke every single treaty, quote unquote, with the great native tribes, but the reality is that both sides almost invariably did. So a raid across a border in force breaks a treaty and starts a war, as we just saw in the Middle East. And both groups, as closely as I can figure this out, did this on average against one another about once a month, if you're talking about communities living in close proximity to one another. Living next to Hamas, in fact, is probably a pretty close analogy to living close to the Comanche. I suppose you could flip that and say that living next to the United States at this time might have been viewed as living in close proximity to the nation of Israel, but I tend to have sympathies in one, to me, pretty obvious direction in that conflict. But that's what I and a research associate and a lot of previous scholars found in the context of Native North America. That's a somewhat esoteric beginning place, but pretty much every other serious topic that I looked at for the book, and for the other books I've written, followed the same pattern of revelation. The people claiming to be the sort of marginalized resistance, in fact, controlled most of the narrative and were basically lying about it. So chapter 2 of the book deals with the Red Scare, for example. And I was lucky enough to talk about this with some of you guys in the student audience earlier. But the general view in upper middle class American life, at least when I was a younger man, when I was a student, I'd be curious to know what it is now, but was that the United States irrationally panicked about communism during the 1950s and the 1960s. So we were persecuting innocent left-leaning artists and writers in the service of stopping this non-existent threat. That was the conventional position. People would use the term McCarthyism as a serious insult. There have been more than a dozen movies, at least from the 12 minutes of research I did on that point, made about this topic. Trumbo, for example, came out in 2015 and won a pack of awards. It was dedicated to the life of the screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, who was accused of being a supporter of the Russians, a quote-unquote pinko during this era. In fact, however, the catch here is that it's no longer disputed, at least in political science, that there were hundreds of Russian spies in the United States during this sort of James Bond era. The full Venona cables, V-E-N-O-N-A, for anyone interested, detailing Soviet contact with their overseas assets were decoded by both sides in the 1990s when the United States was fairly friendly with post-Soviet, kind of start of the Yeltsin era, start of the Putin era Russia. And something that's fairly funny to me, if not to the CIA, is that virtually every falsely accused liberal cause celeb from this period, Alger Hiss, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Trumbo himself, if I recall correctly, actually just was a Russian spy. So they were all guilty, something that we are pressured to forget even now. So the true story wasn't really panic. It wasn't really people freaking out about nothing. It was people recognizing that there were actual enemy agents at the highest levels of our government and trying to make this point and being shouted down as irrational lunatics. Examples might come to mind for you guys today. So, and I mean, the list of these really does go on and on. I mean, within the first 3 chapters of this one book, the 1619 Project is quoted and discussed for a while. I mean, a review of the New York Times that came out a couple of years back now. And obviously, authors there, like Nicole Hannah-Jones, argue that slavery was America's quote-unquote original sin, that slavery was worse in the United States than anywhere else ever to exist, that slavery shaped our entire society, and so on down the line. Just out of curiosity, raise your hand, I guess, if you've read the 1619 Project. A couple people. I don't personally feel you're missing all that much. But the argument of the 1619 Project basically is that almost everything in American society comes from historical slavery. So one of the articles argues that traffic jams are due to slavery. Cities were built to keep whites, blacks, and poor whites, if I have this correct, apart from one another. And so the continued existence of that pattern of urban design is what causes traffic jams. A couple of people have actually looked at this and found that traffic is worse out west than anywhere else in cities that have been built in the past 40 years, so perhaps not true. Another article claims that Americans eat a lot of sugar because that's what the slaves used to grow. So, I mean, that's an absolute statement of the thesis. So, I mean, there were about 15 of these total. This ran in the New York Times Magazine. If you're interested in contemporary left-wing thought, I'd recommend, in fact, reading through this or reading through the 1619 book, which includes essays from Ibram Kendi, Jen Stefanchuk, and so on down the line. But again, it's hard to imagine anything less true. And this, I think, more so than the points about the Indian Wars and who is at fault, is something that is relevant today. Because the idea that the United States has a unique history of racial conflict, although it would no doubt be amusing to an Irishman or Nigerian or many people to arrive here from other places, is something you hear constantly. We recently polled in the Upper South and found that 41% of all American high school students think that only Americans ever had slaves. So obviously, again, it's hard to imagine anything less accurate. Slavery, of course, existed throughout all of human history. You're already aware of that. But one interesting side note I found during the research process is that one of the first 10 or so human words was slave. Humans began writing, actually, for a pretty ignoble reason. People wanted to document the tribute that was being given to kings and so on. So the first words that we came up with were things like cow, sheep, sword, prisoner. And one of them, in Sumerian cuneiform, was slave. It's a corruption of the glyph for man from the mountains with some unfortunate additions, and it basically means captured warrior. It's actually really interesting, to break from the speech for a second, to look at the old pictographic languages just to figure out how humans think. I mean, in, I believe it's ideographic Mandarin Chinese, at least the stereotype is that the word for opportunity is a combination of danger, chance, and some other similar symbols. The Sumerians and Akkadians and all that were even more blunt. I mean, the symbol for marriage is their equivalent of the heart sign being traded for a bag of money. I mean, it's just, you understand that man has come a long way, if nothing else, and that we haven't totally abandoned what we used to be, which is something in relationships and politics and so on to always keep in mind. But all right, I mean, just moving on. The Greeks, and especially the Romans, practiced industrial-scale slavery and treated slaves far worse than any North Americans. The poor bastards fighting tigers shirtless in the arena were all slaves, all still, in this case, mostly captured warriors. The Arab slave trade in both blacks and whites, interestingly enough, lasted 1,000 years and took 17 million people out of Africa alone. It's worth noting that Muslim slave raiders gave the world the two primary terms we use for slave. Slave itself comes from Slav, which means a southeastern European, people from a traditionally poorer region of Europe. They also use the word abid, which means specifically a black slave, someone captured from the West and East African city-states. So, I mean, this is a long-form human institution. By the way, this sounds almost too ridiculous to be true, but a defense on the political left side of the fact that the Arabs traded in both black and white slaves was that at least they were not racist. That American slavery is somehow worse because it ended up focusing on one ethnic group, although for a shorter period of time. But to a large extent, if you add together the core nations of the West, Britain, France, the USA, for that matter, Latin American powers like Brazil, if a bit late there, the core contribution of the Western world to the global slave trade was ending it. That's the only unique thing about slavery in the West. The rest was just as brutal and unpleasant and as focused on military captives as slavery anywhere else. I don't think there's much more to say there. It's a bit awkward to point this out, but where Western colonialism, defined as exported governance, was not a major factor, slavery often still endures. So slavery remains common in Mauritania today. One of my major charitable causes actually is the ending of modern-day slavery. There are probably more slaves in the world today than at any previous time in history. The major Arab states like Saudi Arabia didn't end formal slavery until the 1960s. So again, there's reality and there's what you're expected to believe and say. And I think perhaps more importantly, we see the same general sort of opposite of honesty pattern when it comes to modern events. So for much of the past decade, the BLM, quote unquote, movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, centered around Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, claimed that a near genocide was targeting black Americans. And if this community is anything like Louisville or Chicago, people to a very large extent just sort of went along with this. Super lawyer Ben Crump, an enjoyable guy, actually, with the gloves off. But super lawyer Ben Crump wrote a book that was actually called Open Season, The Legal Genocide of Colored People. And if you add together his police and vigilante and even environmental totals, essentially claimed that white Americans are wiping out tens of thousands of black Americans annually. And again, the book, I think it's fallen off the bestseller list, but can still be found on Amazon as Open Season, The Legal Genocide. I mean, his claims aren't really widely contested, although almost all of them are false. Cherno Biko from the Black Lives Matter organization itself had a lower figure, but he argued on primetime Fox News rather famously that an innocent, presumably unarmed black man is murdered, to use his language, every day by law enforcement, which would come to obviously just under 400 annually. Now, then the actual numbers started dropping. People started looking at some of these almost incredible, in the literal sense, arguments and just sort of testing whether or not they were true, whether they were valid. So the first year that I and the invaluable Heather McDonald looked, back in 2015, the total number of unarmed black people shot by white cops, Caucasian on-duty police officers, was 17. Last year, and it's interesting that that's no longer a shocking total. I mean, for years, you could ask rooms of young black or urban white men what they thought the figure was, and you'd get estimates like 2,000. So perhaps the tide has turned there. But last year, the total across all law enforcement officers, including the 35% black and Hispanic minority, was 16. By the way, well under 100 unarmed citizens of all races are shot by the police annually. There are a lot of conflicts between police and citizens, but it is extraordinarily easy not to be harmed by the police while you are not committing a crime. There isn't even much plain interracial crime, as it turns out. I looked at this in the book as well. There are about 600,000 classic interracial crimes in a typical year. That's, as some of you know, that's usually defined as a violent crime with a black perp and a white victim, or a white perp and a black victim. Now, that's out of about 20 million crimes. So the classic index level, at least violent, they're more property crimes, but violent interracial crimes are about 3% of all crime. The person most likely to kill you is your ex-wife. So, and I've said this line a bunch of dinner party speeches and so on, but it is worth noting there's a distinction here. The person most likely to kill you is your ex-wife or your current husband. So there's actually an interesting gender distinction there, if this is still true, like the men perhaps a bit stupider and more brutal, anger in the moment, women perhaps capable of longer lasting hatred. I don't really know, but I've always found the dichotomy there funny and something for both sexes to watch for. But the interracial crime that does occur, by the way, is unfortunately very unpolitically correct. It's consistently about 80% black on white. That's sometimes pointed out by the quote-unquote dissident right online. I'd say if you're looking for an explanation, you don't really need to go further than there are more white people, they have more money, and there's a higher baseline black crime rate in the first place. It's about 2.3 times the white crime rate, as it turns out. So I think, and obviously interested in any comments, questions you guys have about any of this so far, but I think the final question, and perhaps the most important question, is why the opposite of the truth storyline keeps playing out. And to me, not to be cliche, but the sort of brain parasite that sometimes gets referred to as wokeness, or kind of the modern successor ideology, really does play a large role. If you read your Kendi or your D'Angelo or your Marx or Rousseau or Franz Boas, these are ideas that they're only about 35 human ideas. And the claim that all of, I'm sure there are more than that if you go into patent numbers and so on. But in terms of broad, the core themes of the great religions, what you should do and be in life, there's a reason that philosophy is often criticized as footnotes to Aristotle. And we often see the same sort of thing in political science. I tend to suspect that a number of Roman and Chinese generals had figured out what makes cities function a very long time ago. But so this idea the idea I'm about to outline goes back quite a while. It has quite a pedigree. But wokeness or wokeism is not just a synonym for liberalism. In fact, the two, in my opinion, are opposites. The term refers specifically to a three-part phenomenon that I once broke down in a published piece. So I think, and again, appreciate critiques, but component one is the idea that society today is systemically and intentionally set up to oppress. And the group that is being oppressed can vary. So the modern version of this really did begin with Karl Marx. He took the idea from Rousseau, by the way, who said that society was a trick designed by the people who currently had power to entrap everyone else. So, I mean, the sardonic French way of putting that is the law in its glory commands both the wealthy man and the beggar not to sleep under bridges. The idea in the context of property law was that people who had property wrote law to protect it and to keep everyone else from getting property. But Marx took this theme to the highest level of development, I believe, that we've seen so far. If you put aside the nonsensical economic theory, the kind of core theme that the function of society, facially neutral society, is to hold down certain groups of people. Society is designed by the bourgeois as a tool to control the proletariat, lumpen proletariat, those without power. This is a primary top three function of society. This isn't a full reading of Marx because I consider the economic stuff not really worthy of much consideration, but it is one of the core themes of the text. And I think that the point I'm making here is that most other philosophies that come out of political critical study build on this, but just change the group. So if I had to say this in 30 seconds, critical race theory just takes out the rich man and subs in the white man. All of society is designed for the benefit of white people, the ruling class. Why is the SAT administered before you can enter college? Well, it's not to see who the smartest people are. There's no such thing as intelligence. It is instead to guarantee that a large number of white and white adjacent, whatever that means, people get into college. Radical feminism, in my opinion, some might disagree, takes out the rich man and just subs in the man. So, for example, marriage is an institution designed by men to exploit women's domestic labor and get access to as much sex as possible. Men contribute very little to this relationship. It's a common feminist critique. There are obvious responses looking at some of the guys, but it is a common statement. In queer theory, for example, you take out the rich man and you sub in maybe the good-looking straight man, something like that. All of society is set up to benefit normative people who have normative sexualities, upper middle class, most likely, attractive. And this goes on and on. I mean, there's a Journal of Fat Studies right now. So the argument is that all of society is set up to benefit functional people is the term they use. They don't just say skinny, but not neurodivergent, not overweight, so on down the line. Anyway, the core element of critical theory is all of society is set up to oppress someone. Maybe you. Just wanted to throw that in there. The second element, actually, I think you'd be more likely to get nonsensically lumped into the oppressor class along with me. I don't know if my skin tone would save me, but anyway. The second element, which is a big one, though, this is actually probably the key point for today. The second element of critical theory, first is all of society is set up to oppress and manipulate you. And by the way, if you think that sounds like nonsense, you have false consciousness. All 5 of the philosophical schools I've described so far use almost that exact term. But the second element is that all performance gaps between large groups provide evidence of oppression. The sole variable that can cause these gaps, in fact, is people being oppressed. And finally, this one is not as relevant outside of the business world where I encountered it, but the solution to this is equity in the modern legal sense, which basically means proportional representation without regard to performance. So this is a simple idea, kind of the triune, this is what they're actually talking about, but it has many deep and troubling implications. I would refer to this as an entropic or even evil idea when you think about it as stretched out to its logical conclusion. So for example, this means that when we see performance differences, the group that is failing is in fact failing because other more successful people made them fail. The people struggling or even doing evil are good, and the people doing well are the root cause of evil. It's not really fair, and this is a response I got to my book. You can log into Amazon. I don't suppose you have to log in these days. You can go to Amazon, Goodreads, several academic sites, and see this comment that I'm about to give. It is not really fair to criticize the black or Muslim majority of slave traders, and I admit they were the majority, because Africa and the Middle East are global South regions and often were poorer than colonizing Europe even back then. So the people selling slaves in those areas were doing what they had to, no doubt. You often see this argued quite explicitly, and the real blame lies with those who were oppressing them so that they had to do that awful thing. We Westerners, I'll throw myself in that boat, were the real slavers as we created the global conditions for slavery. Closer to home, we certainly can't call out black-on-black crime or black-on-white crime. The only mentionable cause for these, obviously, is white oppression of black people. This even extends into feminism, which makes some more valid arguments across other points. But I mean, for example, the sole cause of gender gaps, like female underrepresentation among F-15 pilots in combat, is sexism. So it is conventional to believe. The problem with this idea, to me, is that it is religious nonsense. So in reality, everything that you'll study at a university of this quality has multiple causes. Every single thing does. This is one of the first rules of statistics. It's also one of the baseline rules of common sense. So at least a dozen things contribute to black, white, Asian gaps in the United States, which are something that I study professionally. To give perhaps the least controversial, the average black man is 27, at least at the mode. The average white man is 58. 53% of African Americans and only 14% of whites live in the lower income South. Gender gaps exist largely because men and women are genetically different. Rules like young males are the fighters exist among wolves and foxes. So slavery had nothing to do with colonialism. It existed when white Europe was a backwater at the far end of the world, far away from China and India and the Midworld Sea, and it persists most strongly where Europeans of whatever color never settled. Native Americans, importantly, were relatively poor and warlike, not because of oppression and conflict involving whites or blacks, but because of the exact opposite, isolation on the far side of a giant ocean, where trading partners of the kind that existed in the old world, the West and India, for example, simply were not there to engage you. So in real science, we're always multivariate. The last thing you ever want to do is attribute everything that you see to one thing or to one factor. That's again what religions do with karma or faith or sin. So my message is never to do that, perhaps outside of church, if that's your thing. Seek the truth, no matter how complex and unpopular it is, and good on you guys for setting up an institution where that can be done. I'm Will Reilly. Thanks for hosting me.
So I took AP Government, and it turns out AP Government is half AP Government and half politics. So half of the time, you only get 2 months to study government, and the other half of the time you're learning that socialists are pro-free market. And so I was wondering, because you're talking about textbooks, have you read the We the People textbook?
Yeah, actually, We the People was one of the sources for my latest book. Now, the textbook reading portion of that took place 2.5 years ago. My impression was that almost all the textbooks, maybe with the exception of An Unfinished Nation, lean to the political left, which isn't surprising. Some were quite good otherwise. But did you have a specific question about that book?
Well, I was just wondering, because there's a lot of bias in it, especially calling socialists pro-free market. How do you so you're exposing all these textbooks, but how do you find replacements when the AP curriculum in general is so twisted and also it's so attractive because you get college credit?
Well, I actually think that this is an important question. So if you are not even necessarily conservative, but heterodox, and you want alternatives, I mean, one thing you have to do is set them up. I mean, so a friend of mine is Colin Wright, the biologist who makes the daring argument that there are two sexes. And he's recently started writing a series of things that he hasn't had to do for a while, but mid-level academic articles, textbook chapters, and so on, just making this point that there are two sexes, so that every textbook that goes out in human biology will contain a short chapter about how there are two sexes. And I mean, I'm obviously assuming the reason he's doing this is a response to the politicized transgender movement, so that people who are saying, well, obviously this claim is idiotic, aren't just citing sardonic Quillette articles or something like that. So I mean, I think that first, it is a problem that most of American higher and secondary education leans the way it does. It's extremely weird. I mean, you might want to consider how the average, just middle-of-the-road American, rhino Republican or standard liberal, would react to an academy that was 94% dominated by hard-body conservatives from the religious right that kept writing academic articles about how all women should be housewives or something. I mean, it's hard to even think of an equivalent. But I mean, like right now, if I recall my figures correctly from Econ Lib, 19% of university professors, top 300 schools, identify as communist or Marxist. Now, in mainstream society, about half of 1% of people identify as communists. You don't meet a lot of communists. So we do need to fix that. I think first thing would just be very skeptical when you read through that stuff. Respond to it at length in as much as you can in local media, so on. But also at some point, I mean, someone's going to have to write a textbook from another angle. I know New College in Florida is thinking about producing one. Perhaps you guys could do the same. I mean, individual writers should send in chapters, but be aware and then try to respond to some extent, because there is going to have to be an alternative. I mean, like when I looked through the textbooks and I found that 17 were politically liberal and 2 to 3 were politically moderate, there is none over here. And it reminds me of the Rupert Murdoch, the old Fox boss man, whatever you might think of him, once said, he was asked, and this is something we watched when I was in business. He was asked, what made you start this network? What made you think you had client base? And he said, well, 55% of the people in the country weren't being served. And I think that's the situation that we're in right now. So whoever jumps into that market is going to do pretty well, and perhaps it'll be some of you guys.
Thank you.
I'm just interested in modern slavery and how we can try and end modern slavery. Like, should I buy more fair trade chocolate or?
Not really. I mean, so a serious answer if you are a college student is if you do drugs, you should stop. Other than weed, I mean, like a lot of that stuff comes from countries where slave labor, in essence, is used to produce it. But as a more serious answer, because I don't think you have a ongoing cocaine problem or anything.
No comment at this time.
It's hard to tell, buddy. But anyway, one thing I would just do is look up "fight modern day slavery." Let's see if the groups that I've given to in the past are on the top couple. Yeah, I mean, one thing you could do is get involved with any of these groups. I don't know how much I trust the U.S. Department of State, but I've given to Anti-Slavery International, Free Burma Rangers, which is a group that's fighting the corrupt Myanmar government, Our Rescue. I mean, so if it's something that you're interested in from a charitable perspective, I would just, as you get that first, I wouldn't necessarily do it as a college man, but as you get that first decently paying job, that's a cause where they're accepting donations. You can go volunteer. I mean, a lot of direct action is just stuff like people blocking flights. I mean, Greenpeace used to do this with whaling ships and so on. This is a little more serious. But yeah, note that this is a problem that still goes on. Also, a very simple thing you can do is just respond to people who are bringing up slavery as an issue that affected only Black West Africans only 200 years ago just in this country. So discuss the current breadth of the issue. And yeah, I wouldn't do things that directly contribute, but it's honestly pretty hard to avoid buying things that aren't quote unquote fair trade. I wouldn't make my entire life more complicated to try to do that. I would write a check every couple of months or something. Like, I mean, I just looked that up on a Samsung Galaxy, and I mean, I don't think that was built entirely by American unionized labor.
First off, I want to thank you for your time coming here. This was a really interesting talk. But I wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on what's known as intersectionality, how you were talking about, feminism and like Black Lives Matter stuff, how it's subbing in different like male or different privileged people, but where intersectionality comes in that we hear so much about is all of those are correct, and that it's actually all of the above instead of just realizing, oh, wait a minute, no, this is the same cope just with different words.
Well, I have a professional response to that as a stats guy. I think that intersectionality is just a badly done regression model. I mean, for those of you that are going into stats, basically the idea of intersectionality is it's not just one thing that affects your life, like being black, it's as many as 4. I've never seen an analysis that they do that has more than that, but it's say if you're a black bisexual woman, you will have a tougher life than if you were a black straight man. That may be true, but my response to that is when we actually look at life outcomes in real political science or economics, you put like 80 things, not anymore, the tastes have changed, but you put, say, 12 things into the analysis, and you'd certainly also want to look at social class, IQ, attractiveness. There are hundreds of things that determine where you will end up in life. So intersectionality is just an attempt to look at only a couple of those variables from sort of a woke perspective, in my position, or in my opinion. One final comment on this. One of the academic pieces I've written looks at, sketched up at this point, but looks at the impact of a bunch of different variables on an actual test of privilege. If you Google check my privilege, it sounds a little silly, but you'll actually find a test that was designed by, as I recall, Ivy League grad students that led the BuzzFeed website for a while. It's got about 110 questions that ask things like, have you ever gone to bed hungry? Have you ever lost a physical fight? That really do a pretty decent job of measuring the ease of your life. And I've administered that test. Students have asked to take it. People have taken it in pretty large groups, Greek organizations and the like. And what you find if you look at the results, and we haven't really done the huge 5,000 past human subjects version yet, but what you find if you look at the results is that about 70% of privilege is just social class. Like, it's just income. If you put in a variable that asks what your income is for the young executive types or what your parents' income is for students, you'll find that the huge predictor of how easy and effective their life was where they were raised, what their background was. So I think that that's my response to intersectionality. If it doesn't include class, if it doesn't include politics, urban, rural, north, south, how good you look, all that stuff, it's pretty much worthless.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think they do want to include that, but they don't want to say it outright because it makes them look worse.
Well, it's a fairly awkward situation. I mean, so like a question that I used to ask just when I was a college guy debating, but I mean, this would be 2008, 2009, was, do you think Barack Obama is oppressed? And it's almost just like the cliche, easy first line, opening chess move. But I mean, people would often say, yeah. And I would note that Barack Obama was the most powerful man in the world. He could blow up the planet. He's 6'4". He's a millionaire. IQ 140 or whatever else that translates to. Like, doesn't that matter? And people would say, well, what if he gets pulled over by a cop? I mean, and the answer is that the Secret Service would shoot the guy. But it's just, there are many, many variables that come into, many variables that come into play.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for being here. You had mentioned that the source for this sort of ideology, I guess, is wokeism. And I was curious how you thought that that ideology ended up sort of finding its way into the high levels of society. Like, what do you think was the mechanism behind the proliferation of wokeism?
Well, that's an interesting question. I thought you were going to ask a slightly different question, so I'll answer that one first. I think that the woke mind virus, to quote Gad Saad, is probably one of the things that humans are just prone to. So humans are competitive predators. I mean, like, when you see a reasonably fair system, like modern American secondary education, and it produces very disparate results, like average SAT scores in the USA range from 910 for Native Americans to 1260 for Asian Americans. When you see that kind of gap, it's very easy to conclude not, well, Native Americans should hit the books more, which with a little bit of sympathy actually pretty much is my conclusion, but it's very easy to conclude that the system is itself unfair. So I think that the idea that society was set up to hurt you, especially since there has been very legitimate discrimination against, for example, women in the past. I don't think anyone would deny that. It's very easy to say, well, this is what's going on. This is what causes these problems. So I think that's why wokeism is tempting. Like, basically, if you are currently a loser, like right now I need to lose like 40 pounds. I mean, I was a college level and not extraordinarily good competitive athlete. I just eat and relax too much. But I mean, another way that I could respond to that would be by saying, well, the American food system is designed to ruin my body, or, you know, obesity is a genetic, almost unovercomable problem, or other things that are becoming increasingly popular. If you're failing, you can either blame yourself and the team around you or the world. Blaming the world is tempting. How did this become popular? Why did people start believing this? I think the short answer is that we had a temporary cultural revolution in the 1960s. Most of the ideas that we're talking about today, great society welfare, critical race theory, radical, not early wave, we want jobs, feminism, all that stuff came out of this period between 59 and 72. And I mean, when the revolution ended, those people actually still remember my friends' dads hating to be teased about selling out. Growing up in the 80s, like, these people just went into business and academia. That's the answer. These people that had been, to a certain extent, almost infected with these ideas during this period of our clashing with the communist society, went into very specific fields. How do you get 19% Marxists in academia? You get a lot of communists applying to tenure-track jobs. I think that's the answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Reilly. This is a very interesting talk. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a great fan of your work. I was hoping that you could comment on a lie that you did not address in your talk, although it might be in the book. I've not had a chance to read it yet. But how is it that even though they have very comparable murder rates, in fact, if anything, the communists have the edge over the fascists. Fascists killed 10 million people in the 20th century, and communists killed 50 to 150 million people. How is it that communism has this, is treated or is perceived, I think, across society, particularly on the left, but across society as somehow defensible, where fascism clearly is not?
I think one glib but real answer is there aren't a lot of upper middle class fascists.
But why is that? So why is that? How has communism survived?
A couple different reasons. So first of all, one of the reasons, at root, what I said is basically correct. The reason communism is more tolerated than fascism is that a very large number of people in the media, academia, in the knowledge-producing institutions, because I don't think that left-wing, purple-haired people control industrial business or something. But a very large percentage of people in the knowledge-producing institutions would identify as socialists or communists. That is almost certainly the reason. The question as to why that is, I mean, I think that in World War II, the fascists were largely defeated. I mean, Hitler was crushed, killed himself, Mussolini was hanged. Fascism did not appear to be an enduring ideology likely to survive, if I had to speculate on this. Communism did. I mean, our great rival was the USSR. The USSR funded a great deal of the American left, a lot of the peace movement. And because of that, you saw this continue on in American society quite a bit longer. I also think communism just sounds better than fascism. Fascism says, you know, some people are better than others. Many of you should just follow orders. Let's go fight for the country. Communism in practice produces the same outcomes. But what communism says, to some extent, is all of us are almost entirely equal. We are being robbed by a small group of external predators. Why don't we defeat them, unify together, and make utopia? So I think that people often say, well, the communists, sure, they may have killed 10 times as many people, but they had good intentions.
Right, okay, so that's the answer I was looking for.
Yeah, they had good intentions. Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for an illuminating talk. I'm curious about the persuasiveness of empirical falsification. So when we hear these stories and these allusions to, for instance, the incarceration of or the murdering of black men, these are not simply indications of facts. And if they were so, then they could simply be falsified by pointing to evidence. Rather, they're indications of myths that sustain our vision of what America ought to be. And it occurs to me that the effort to falsify them merely pivots upon the observations we can make about the world, but doesn't in fact inform how we tell the story again. That is, it doesn't create new myths. It simply allows us the option of reinforming our myths. So I wonder if the better option is not simply to point to the falsification of facts, but rather to try to envision a new myth that would be better than the old myth. That is a way of indicating things that are happening that allows us to tell a better story. And if that's the case, then can we not entirely dispense with what you call religious nonsense? Should we not inspire to be the myth makers rather than the falsifiers?
I think that's a great question. That's a very good question. I think that there are two responses. One, of course, there are almost mythical replies in the sense of the literary use of the term mythos. I mean, and many of them just come immediately to mind, like, no, this is the land of the free and a reasonably fair place, and so on. So yes, I think people should advance some of those too. I would speculate that many of those aren't dramatically more true than, I mean, if you talk about American history, our history was in fact a great and clean conquest or something. That's not really accurate either. But to the extent people can develop a modern mythos, a modern idea of what we can be and ought to be, yes, I think people should do that. You guys should all start working on that. But there's actually a second part, though. As you know, when you debate for the audience, not for your opponent. Like, I mean, I've had debates with everyone from Jared Taylor of the alt-right to, at least online, Ibram Kendi, and neither of those guys is going to change their position and become a civic nationalist. So when you're talking for all the people, there are perhaps 100 or so people in this room and around it that are listening to you. So I don't think most people know that all the stuff BLM said even now is just bullshit, excuse me. Like, the Skeptic Research Center, again, great think tank, looked at what urban black and white men thought was the case in terms of relationships with the police. And they found that the average man, they were asked about the number of unarmed black people they think are killed annually. And so 35% of them, at least on the left, said about 1,000. Another 14 to 15% said about 10,000. This is the number of unarmed brothers that were killed annually. And 8% said more than that. Now, to put that in context, there are only about 20,000 murders in a year. And we're overrepresented, but African Americans make up maybe half of those. So people thought there were as many police shootings of innocent people as there were murders. And when you confront someone who believes that with the actual number of unarmed people that were killed by the police, 10, I think very often I have seen dramatic reversals. I have seen people leave movements and so on. So both would be my suggestion.
Thank you for your time here. My question to you was about the Red Scare, because the narrative that I was told in school was that the Red Scare prosecuted people who were suspected communists, not necessarily Russian spies. Professors, Hollywood directors, stuff like that. Is that narrative distorted? And if not, what exactly would the people tried be guilty of?
Well, I think that's a fascinating question. And the implication is, are you allowed to believe in things that are crazy and antithetical to your society, but that fall under that general domain of free speech? So, I mean, I think the first response would be, we know if you just go to the encyclopedia article for the Venona cables, a number of political scientists have put up the list of everyone that was in the Venona cables. So we know that about 700 of the people that were harassed during the Red Scare were just Russian spies. I mean, that's a pretty large cadre of Russian agents in the United States. I mean, you know, there were people who were likely Russian assets, if not agents. I mean, sitting with Truman at Yalta. So that's point one. This was something that got fairly deep into the United States. So you're faced with those kind of preventing 9/11 sort of questions. You know, there were other. I don't think anyone would deny that the Red Scare sometimes crossed some. No one would deny that HUAC and the Senate Un-American Activities Committee specifically sometimes crossed some lines during that era. I think, again, the question is that most people do not know that probably the top, let's limit it to 500 targets of the Red Scare were actually involved with the Russians. So I think that's the sort of debunking or the point that's important there. I actually got this question earlier, and it's been very, very well phrased both times. Should you be able to have a policy that, let's say, would keep people out of the government that want to work with entities that are aiming at destroying your society? I would say, yeah, I don't really have a problem with that. I mean, if you're a member of the American Communist Party in the 1950s, one of the things you were dedicated to is the destruction of the United States. I mean, I've read their charter. So if you just say, well, I'm a socialist or I'm a bit of a Marxist, your boss might tease you, but I don't see government officials investigating you even then. The question was, are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And I guess that is my last line. This is an opinion statement. But the equivalent would be perhaps being a member of Hamas today. I don't see any reason that we would have to maintain you in a federal working position or any civic job or help you avoid some tough questions from Congress if you were a member or associate of that organization. So some lines are crossed, but I think the basic point was valid.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure, yeah.
Do you think there should be a legal difference in a court of law for if you were spying for a friendly country like Japan versus like a hostile or not as friendly country like China?
Well, there is. We don't kill you. I mean, and that's said a bit glibly, but as I understand, if you are engaged in espionage for a non-hostile power, and I don't know whether this is the upper cap on the law or just a gentleman's convention, but you're not going to die. You're not going into our equivalent of the Russian Gulag, Guantanamo, or something like that. So in practice, as I understand, we have one crime of espionage, and the maximum penalties for espionage are extremely high. What you're describing, I think, would fall under mitigating circumstances or incidental factors in the case. But yeah, in practice, we're not going to treat a Japanese spy the way we would treat a Russian spy. People spying for Israel, Mexico, and countries like that are actually, if you kind of get into Google Scholar and dig into that second tier of articles, that happens pretty often. You'll find spies from unexpected countries like Nigeria. You know, and you just, I would suspect we give them a beating and send them home. I mean, that sounds a bit inelegant, but I assume they go to an unpleasant place for a couple of weeks and we put them on a plane and ship them out. So yes, that seems more appropriate to me than execution or something like that.
Hello, thank you for your time. I'm always struck in conversations like this about the idea of a culturally dominant narrative that, still here we are, and because we aren't part of that culturally dominant narrative, we are sort of able to promote these ideas and profit off of them and still talk about them. I mean, we're still free to discuss. So I'm kind of curious in what ways you think that we as conservatives or heterodox thinkers are tangibly victimized by this dominant narrative.
Well, I don't think that anyone in the United States, I mean, I understand you asked the question that way for a reason, but I don't really think anyone in the United States is victimized today. I mean, or oppressed or something like that. I suppose there might be Native Americans on reservations or something like that, or people who've been sex trafficked. But if you see like a black guy, a white guy, and a Hispanic guy arguing about who currently suffers more discrimination, like they're all gonna make it. There are 2 points there. One, you're asking, what's the practical impact of being non-dominant in narrative right now? The short answer would be society doesn't cater to you and you do face discrimination. I mean, that's really it. I mean, so for those of you that plan on going into academia, if you're good, you'll probably get hired. But bear in mind that you're entering a workspace where 90% of the people are going to disagree with you on most things and are going to view very basic things like saying, well, I'm not that much of a feminist, or, as a black guy, I feel I have a slight advantage over my white buddies. Things you might not agree with, but that would come up in any casual dinner party conversation as horrible. I mean, like, you can literally end your career. I've talked to some of your faculty members here, but people have sent business emails saying, I disagree with your university policy on October 7th. And that's, you can get shown the door for that unless you have full-on tenure. Same thing can happen in the business world. So that's the answer. I think you'll face annoying, frequent discrimination.
First of all, thank you for your time again. I have a two-part question. How is it advantageous for left-wing politicians to side with the idea that U.S. politicians have historically been oppressive? And the second part is, how can it make sense that these same politicians are losing the support of the working class?
Well, so I think the short answer for this gets into, again, in business, we used to call this the horizon window, like where the paper company cuts down all the trees. Why would you ever do something so stupid? Well, because we need to sell a lot of paper this quarter. I mean, I don't think that left-wing politicians backing the idea that the United States of America is an evil place that shouldn't exist, or some of the more extreme things you hear, will, in the end, produce good results. I think right now people say that stuff because they know a large audience wants to hear it. Students want to hear it. Members of certain activist minority groups want to hear it. So, I mean, like, one of the major pressure points on Kamala Harris right now is that if you listen to Democratic consultants, one of whom's a good buddy of mine, who will not be named here, but like, if you listen to them, one of the big points of pressure on Kamala Harris is that she's not denouncing the genocide in Gaza. I mean, the war begun by Hamas about a year ago. And I think that I wouldn't be surprised if she did, as well as denouncing Arab atrocities against the Israelis. Why would you say something like that? Well, because it gets you 1 million votes. I think that's the short answer. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
How can it make sense that these same left-wing politicians are losing the support of the working class?
Oh, that's an excellent question. But I mean, I think it's just the flip side of what you just said. I think that denouncing America, denouncing major allies like Israel, or for that matter, some of the frenzy about Latin America on the right, that kind of stuff is not going to be productive. I don't think most people want to hear that. So why are they doing it? Amoral sociopathy? Basically, why does a politician do anything except take your money? Why are they losing the vote of the working class? I think the short answer is that working class people are more likely than upper middle class college students to disagree with most of these policies. So Morgan and I actually talked about this a little bit. I mean, you guys here are among the institutions that are doing some good statistical work on this. But there's a major split in the Democratic Party between people that are just liberal, often members of minority groups, feminist women, union workers, like just people who say, like, I obviously like America, I think we're a force for good, but I also want health care. I mean, like, what's a reasonable left-wing issue? Child care. I mean, like, they're all kind of reasonable left-wing issues, actually. So, I mean, there's a big split between those people and people who think that the woke ideas have a coherent value, like it's disrespectful not to use someone's preferred pronouns or something like that. And what you actually find, you might correct this a little bit, but what you actually find is that the people who are more woke are more upper class, more college educated, so on, by far, than the people who aren't. So I think that a lot of the things that are being pushed by, like, the left in the political sense aren't things most Democrats want. Said that 2 or 3 times, just sort of ramblingly. But that's basically the issue. Also, a last point, the Democrats are trying to figure out right now how to handle being the party of the rich. So, I mean, as you've seen growth in sectors like tech and DEI, and you've seen a decline in sectors like industrial manufacturing, the stereotype of the businessman as being right-wing is changing. I mean, like, the largest donors to the Democratic Party are companies like Goldman Sachs, Halliburton. This would have been unheard of 20 years ago. So, I mean, if you're trying to appeal to that new donor base, that new voter base, how does that affect your current voter base? Bernie Sanders has said this very explicitly. Like, he kowtowed a little bit during his last campaign, but his basic point is, you can like me or dislike me, but I'm almost a Marxist. I'm a socialist. I want to give money to poor people. Why are we talking about, like, black Harvard students' dating problems? I mean, like, what does that have to do with anything? Like, I'm supposed to be working for the miners and so on, and you guys are supposed to be working for management, and we're supposed to be in the middle. And I think that's a pretty reasonable perspective for a leftist to have.
Professor, thank you for your time.
Of course.
I have a quick question about taboos, which you discussed in the library and online. I guess taboos being the obvious thing that it's uncomfortable to talk about. So with the examples you gave, like with race and gender and some of those other taboo subjects, they don't initially begin as taboos and then they change into becoming taboos. So what do you think are the causes of that, and how can we identify something that might be in that category in the future?
The causes are really varied and are hard to predict. I mean, the primary cause is changing social moods and attitudes, but I think there's a lot of research on what predicts those, but I haven't seen the best Nate Silver type quants that look at where what's the book, Macro Trends, where that stuff's going to go in the future, have a good record of predicting that. As I recall, the latest Macro Trends book came out about 2 or 3 years ago and predicted AI would never amount to anything. So I tend to be pretty skeptical of that stuff. But basically, your definition of a taboo is on point. A taboo is an obvious or obviously true thing that you can't say. Men and women are different. There are different test scores in different ethnic groups. Cops are in the hood more because there's more crime there. Just on and on. Anyone can think of 10. But what those will be in the future, I don't know. They tend to be the rate of change tends to be almost unexpected. A taboo is something that you could logically see as problematic, but that also is almost certainly real. Something, maybe eating meat. I could see as lab-grown meat becomes more common, one of the critiques of you guys will be like, you savages ate the flesh of living animals. So it's very hard to predict. Like for 10,000 years, humans enslaved battle captives and made them work. Now we let them go or kill them. I mean, is the second more developed? Not really, but we've come to the idea that this thing, which you can understand as bad, that we don't need anymore. Okay, this is an answer to your question. Things that could be understood as bad, that are no longer needed, perhaps, are very likely to become taboos. So, I mean, I think that the criticism of you guys in this generation, one would probably be eating meat. Another would probably be misuse of digital media, like something like 3% of all young people are on OnlyFans right now. I mean, I have no idea, but I think they're going to vary up and down, and they would be rather difficult for us to predict. That wasn't a great answer. This one will be.
Thank you for coming out. I've just really appreciated your lecture. Your points are sharp, and your humor is really great. I find it personally top tier. My question is more of just in your opinion, I would guess. To me, it seems that political parties aren't so much as people figuring things out through facts as much as it is almost like a personality trait that kind of pulls them towards one side of the spectrum. Do you think that more empathetic people or people wishing to escape some form of resentment or trauma or more, I guess, pinpointed or tempted to fall into ideas such as Marxism? And from that, do you think that there's something psychological going on in our culture that is slowly affecting us to lean more towards the face of resentment for the world?
Yeah, I mean, all these have been really good questions. I'm not the give yourself a round of applause type of guy, but good stuff. So in terms of answering that question, yeah. So the first part is just, I mean, if that's an insight you came to on your own, it's an impressive one. Yes, personality traits and predictable traits do predict your politics. If you see that someone is a conservative, military-age male with past military service, they're a conservative. It's about 94, 95%. I forget the latest research. But yeah, so I mean, obviously, your traits do predict how you vote. The more empathic you are, there are articles on this. I haven't read them recently, but I would imagine the more you want to give to others, the more likely you are to be a socialist. Yeah. I think the more interesting part of that is, so why are we moving left now? Why is at least the youth population moving to a point where 61% of people say socialism is good? I think that the answer is because people are becoming weak and soft. But I would probably phrase that differently in a different audience. But I mean, to some extent, I think that those experiences that train people in the lack of empathy, which is very important, by the way. Empathy is generally bad outside your family and friends. If you have $100 and you could take the person you like the most on a date, or you could help your aging mother, or you could give that to a homeless guy, They're all not evil options, but the worst of those is to give that to a homeless guy. And there are multiple examples in ethics books that break this down. So I think we're becoming more empathic because the training in the lack of empathy, military service rates are down, rates of varsity athletic participation are down. Even just growing up in large families where you'll spar sometimes with your brothers, but then help them out if they have an issue with their homework, that's down. So people have trouble disconnecting that baseline level of emotion from how you should behave in life. Unless you're evil, everyone feels sorry for those that are suffering. The question is, how much do you take from yourself, the people closest to you, so on down the line to help people that are currently in that situation? And they're actually, like, the ancients actually answered this. I mean, both the Greeks and the Hebrews said 10%, maybe. You add that up at the end of the year, that's what I and my fiance do when we give to charity. So, like, there is an answer there. Well, actually, that's affected by the fact that now I have to pay taxes. But there is an answer there, but just being excessively empathic is not a good thing, and I think we are training people to do that. I think there's a lot of evidence of that.
Okay, I was just gonna ask, you keep talking about like the results and the differences between ethnicities, races, and you've acknowledged that there is biological difference between genders. So do you think this also applies to races? Like, is there a reason, like I was just looking at the stats and stuff, like how drastically different? I think it's like 14 times more between non-Hispanic blacks, non-Hispanic whites. For violent crime rate. And do you think maybe that's because certain people live together for like 3, 4, or 5,000 years, developed a certain way, and then when we push them all together, they're going to be different?
Yeah, so I first of all, I don't think that's an evil idea. I mean, hereditarianism, as that's called, is one of those things that was for a long time just a respectable scientific paradigm. I argue against it personally, but I've read Charles Murray, Arthur Jensen, so on. In terms of some of that stuff, I tend to think that so the short answer is hereditarianism is a legitimate scientific paradigm. There could be biogenetic differences between human ethnic groups. I mean, if nothing else, you notice they're all different colors, right? I mean, like there obviously are, people have bright red hair and so forth. I mean, you know, by no means just yourself. I recently looked at some interesting data on Ireland. But I tend to think that the actual gaps that we would see between large racial groups given equal training would be pretty small. I mean, so like the 14x BW violent crime gap, that actually, it's down to 11x, that's only for murder. If you go to the BJS and CVS, the Bureau of Justice Statistics National Crime Victimization Survey, and I'd recommend you do that as opposed to like either black guys or alt guys on the internet, not that that's where this sort of information comes from. But like, I would, like if you look at the full column on crime, like all the index crimes, which includes like arson, child molestation, human trafficking, which is a very heavily Hispanic crime right now. The black violent crime rate's about 2.3x the white rate. Whites actually dominate some property crimes because of the impact of opiates in Appalachia. You know, and in fact, actually, the county jail is one of the most diverse places you'll ever be unless you join the military. I mean, right now, crime is about 55% Caucasian, it's 25% black, which is a 2-to-1 overrepresentation, can't minimize that, and it's 20% Hispanic. So, no, when I look at figures like that, I don't think that's primarily genetic. I would say the biggest cause of high crime rates in the black community is extreme rates of family collapse. So, I mean, if you read Tom Sowell or anyone like that, you know, in 1938 and 1946, they're kind of bracketing World War II, the illegitimacy rate or out-of-wedlock birth rate, if you prefer, in the black community was 11%. Whites were doing even better at the time, it was 4 to 5%. But I mean, now, if you look at those rates, it's, I think, 38.5% for whites. I don't want to overstate for anyone, but it's 55% for Mexican Americans, 65% for Puerto Ricans, 67% for natives, and 69% for African Americans. So we're doing the worst, but it's the worst of like a pretty bad lineup. And I mean, I would say that when you look at that for Caucasians, I mean, that 900% increase in that variable, that stuff is almost certainly cultural. I wouldn't use the term environmental. People that look at that often are looking at the single variable of SES or income. So you don't equalize black and white IQ scores, for example, if you just adjust for income. But if you adjust for literally 2 or 3 other things like father in the home, books in the home, you generally do. My response to this is I think the culturalists are probably about 80 to 90% right, but I think people should actually do more research on this. Like you should throw the genetic proxy, use twins or something like that, and the cultural proxy, hours of study in the model that like tests racism and see which one of them works better. And I think what you'd find is most of the time racism would have no impact left at all. Yeah, thanks for asking the question. That's one of those things that obviously a lot of people wonder about. I really don't think we know much about racial differences. I just don't think they're going to be particularly large. Like, I mean, I was a distance runner for a while and also would-be basketball player, but better at running 50 pounds ago. And I once looked at all the track records by race because the stereotype is this is one of the things that's most clearly racially defined, right? You always see a bunch of Kenyan guys, then a bunch of white guys, then a bunch of Asian guys, and then like everyone who's not getting paid. And I mean, I was curious about what the top performances were, and there are racial differences, but like the top Kenyan time is 2 hours and 2 minutes for the marathon, the 26 miler. The top white time is actually quite good. It's like 2:04 something. They're trying not to count it right now because of wind resistance or something. This wasn't my race, thank God. But the top Asian time is like 2:05. I think that those are the kind of gaps you'd see, where you see one group dominating certain things. Like, man, we have a lot of Jewish American astronauts. But if you were really looking at who's making the varsity football team or something like that, it would be extremely diverse given equal starting points.
Thank you for your time, and I appreciate your work very much. In terms of when we're trying to discuss these issues with people who might have been, partially or fully infected by the woke mind virus, many of these people are our fellow members of society. They might be our neighbors. In my discussions with them, it's been very difficult because it feels like we're talking past each other. So what would you recommend I've tried dunking on them with statistics, which might feel good temporarily, but I feel like it draws us further apart from having a productive conversation that will lead them to the truth. So what would you recommend? Have you had any experiences with discussing these matters with people, maybe people who aren't within the dark triad? There are many people who are just allies and are not psychopathic or sociopathic. So what would you recommend in terms of helpful rhetorical strategies or what have you?
I would recommend the two old debaters' tricks. One, define your terms, what do you mean? And you're gonna often find, so if you're talking to someone, the one thing that's consistent with all woke people is that they think all differences fit their three-point model. So you have to understand society is set up to oppress, you have to understand gaps show oppression, you have to understand the solution is equity. So every time someone has told me let me educate you, we need to have a conversation about race, it breaks down to those things. Don't you know that there is systemic oppression in the United States or something like that? So I think the first point would be define your terms. Is that the framework you're coming from, one? And second, what do you mean by things like systemic oppression? And then I just ask a lot of questions when I'm talking with someone. One of the ones I used recently when someone was arguing that almost no black students could succeed was just, I did pull up a stat. It was some of my stuff on discrimination, but I said, statistically, it looks like overweight white women have a bit of a harder time. Do you think no overweight white women can succeed? And I was like, that's ridiculous. You think chubby white girls can't make it? That's insulting. You're a sexist. And it was that's what you're saying though, right? You don't think people can study 5% more? And that's something that rarely comes up in these conversations. I recently wrote a response, this was one of my academic pieces, to the whole literature on kind of audit studies, which are studies where you send in 1,000 resumes to a business and you see whether white guys are more likely to get hired than black guys. And I had two questions in the article. One, if you gave the white guy and the black guy the same name but indicate the black guy is black, his name is Mark Blackman instead of Jaquivius, which is an actual name that's been used, is there any difference in hiring? And the second article was, the second question was, if your name is Jaquivius, couldn't you just apply as J. Thomas Brown? So I think that basic question of, are there very easy ways to get around most of these barriers? That's something that's almost never asked. I'd like to see asked more. But for you to answer your question directly, I would ask people to define exactly what they're talking about and make them say that. Do you think that I am, as a male, a member of an oppressor group? Do you think that, do you actually view this as a systemically racist country? How? What do you mean? That's point one. And then start asking them questions okay, so if this systemic racism has whites on the top, who would you expect to be the richest group in the country? If you're really having an ongoing, sitting there with a glass of wine conversation about this. Okay, is that the richest group in the country? Who would you expect to be the second? Is that? Third, is that? The poorest, is that? And I actually think it's pretty hard to sustain this looking at the real data. The wealthiest group in the country right now is Indian Americans. Number two is Jewish Americans. Number three is Taiwanese people. So if you actually say, well, historically, what discrimination has there ever been against Jews? I think then you're in a losing battle. The poorest group right now is Appalachians. So Scots-Irish people who live in the mountains in the Southeast. So, I mean, I would ask questions. What do you mean? What do you mean? Can you defend this? I wouldn't attack. I wouldn't say, like, you're obviously an idiot. Just make them support their thesis.
Okay, I'll try it on Twitter. Thank you.
Yeah, and Twitter is a site that exists for dunking on people. That's mostly what I do on Twitter. I'll retweet someone with comments like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. And then that's generally what goes viral. But I don't really think that changes too many minds. Like, you do that. One thing that's worth noting is that there's nothing wrong with preaching to the choir. Like, if you're the pastor in a church, you want to preach to the choir because they're in the church. So there's nothing wrong with helping out your friends or jumping into arguments, but just understand you're not going to change a skilled opponent's mind that way, really, ever.
Thank you for coming and giving us some of your time. I wanted to ask, we always hear about politicians saying we need unity, we need to unify. Barack Obama in 2004 saying not just red states, blue states, but the United States. But conservatives have claimed that Obama in his 2012 campaign and 2012 term, his rhetoric worsened racial relations. Democrats claim Donald Trump in his entirety worsened racial relations, the 2020 BLM riots. And then this election term, you see Kamala and Trump both campaigning specifically to the African American community. So in your opinion, what is the sole contributor or contributors that have led to this perceived worsening of racial relationships in the United States?
Well, I mean, I think that the constant back and forth between the people of different races and political parties, which to me comes more from the left, is what's worsened race relations. I don't think there's a debate about that. This, again, is empirical data that I've worked with. I mean, and the one thing that people have to remember, I'm tempted to say something like, you young whippersnappers, but like when I was growing up in like 1998 in Chicago, we weren't living in the Jim Crow South. So I mean, like most people, probably 55% of relationships at my high school were interracial. So when people in that kind of Jordan and Bird era were polled about race relations, about 70% of both whites and blacks said they were good. Asian Americans as well, actually, 64%, something like that. Now, if you poll people about race relations, only 30% of whites and 33% of minorities say they're good. So we've empirically tanked race relations during the era of wokeness and the angry alt response. And in fact, you kind of wonder if that was the goal. I mean, I would wonder how many of these people that are on social media saying all this kind of crap are, foreign agents. That's certainly something I would look into if I were a Chinese spy with some wit. But we've made this worse. And I guess to get into your question, I think the rhetoric from the Democrats overall, now obviously I openly have a center-right bias, but the rhetoric from the Democrats I don't think has been any better. In fact, I think it's been slightly worse, more than slightly worse. I mean, and this is an important point because we frequently hear, like, we've never heard anything like Trump before. I mean, Kamala Harris the other day literally said, if this guy's elected, we won't have our democracy anymore. We have to do everything we can, anything we can think of to stop this guy. Now, this is someone who's been shot at twice. I mean, so I don't, 4 times. Okay, yeah, I didn't think the third guy got close enough to shoot at him. There, 30 times, whatever, just a few. What's an assassination attempt between friends? But I mean, like, so, when you know someone's trying to kill your rival and you go out there and say, like, my God, we're never going back, do whatever it takes. I mean, I do think that because of the slant in the media, there's less focus on that than there is on Trump's equivalent nonsense. I don't, by the way, like, I'm going to vote for him over Harris, but I don't think that Trump is an ideal candidate either. He's 80 years old and often goes off on these sort of rants himself. I mean, I think there's a place, like, a lot of people have said when Mitt Romney and Barack Obama ran against each other, I found them both boring and they said a lot of crap about each other, but they both looked like they were professionals who could avoid starting a war for at least a couple of months. And I think that the general perspective on our elections has fallen off in terms of confidence since then. I think that the reasons for that are obvious. But I mean, I think that this rhetoric is, yes, it's harmful. It has damaged race relations. We can measure that empirically. And yeah, I think the worst of it's come from the left. The last line for me, because I think there's one follow-up you might have, but last line from me. I think the BLM situation is actually the classic example of this, right? Where like people are allowed to go on national television and say like there's a genocide going on. Every day, several of us are killed. I mean, none of this bore any resemblance to the truth. So I think that's the craziest thing about that era in history.
Thanks for being here. With your convincing refutation of all the incredible statements that have been fed to us through the media and other people, you you made a couple statements of your own that to me sounded incredible, and you didn't qualify them during your presentation. One of them was the statement about there being more slaves in the world now than there were ever before, which may be true, but maybe there's other things to consider, like per percentage-wise, what slavery actually means, all these other factors to consider. And the other one was that all the people prosecuted by the HWAC were all guilty of espionage, which you did qualify later. But my question is not so much whether or not these claims are true, but shouldn't we, when we're trying to address nonsense and unempirical claims from the left, try to avoid at all costs making our own unqualified claims, because then we just have a textbook from one extreme and a textbook from the other extreme, but very little balance?
Yeah, so again, as with the hereditarianism question, I mean, thanks for asking that. Obviously, yeah, I think there's a fairly obvious difference. So the first point would simply be, I don't think that I'm trying to lie. So if someone comes up and this is an important point, like if someone comes up and says, hey, I disagree with that claim, can we review it? I think most people who aren't hacks are going to just say, yeah. I mean, so that's the core difference. I mean, if you go up to someone who is incredibly woke, or for that matter, on the furthest edge of the dissident right, and you say, hey, what makes you say that? Are you willing to sit down and talk about it with me? They're going to say, hell no. I mean, unless you're willing to convert to my perspective, generally, at least in my experience. As it turns out, both of those claims are at least defensible. I might give you the second one, but there are more slaves in the world today than there were in the past. Now, the question there is a per capita analysis, right? So if there are 100 million slaves today, which is an argument you commonly hear when people invoke Mauritania, they count bond serfdom in Saudi Arabia, South India, so on. I mean, that's a reasonable figure. In the past, I mean, like during the entire Atlantic slave trade, there were 12 million slaves, mostly black West Africans sold out of Africa. Arab slave trade, 17 million Africans, maybe 6 million whites. So, I mean, then this is over a course of time, of course. So, I mean, the Atlantic slave trade went on for about 300 years. Yeah, there were more slaves today. Now, the response, which you gave intelligently, is there are also more people. Yeah, I mean, but I didn't say slaves per capita. You know, there's just a bunch of slaves. And I think if you told most people that there are 100 million slaves today, or 40 million is perhaps a more realistic, like definite bonded, not leaving figure, I think they would be very shocked by that. Again, the majority of people think of slavery, in my experience in the United States, as something bad that happened to black people in the United States or most black people in the West. That is not accurate. I mean, the huge majority of slaves today are not in this part of the world. Like I mentioned, one of the groups that's responding to this is in Burma. So no, I think it's a good point, and I do vet through these speeches. That's something I might do a little more intensely. But no, I think that one's defensible. The everyone was a Russian spy. Well, I think that refers to the people in that paragraph. So I mean, you've got Hiss, you've got the Rosenberg, so on. Probably the top 5 or 6 cause celebs on the left, like they are people mentioned in the Venota cables with handlers. I mean, like there's not really any dispute in those cases. So I mean, it's a good point. So you should always, as an author and speaker, read more closely. Like, thanks for pointing that out. But I mean, I wouldn't put that in the same category as there's a genocide of black people in the United States or something.
Yeah, I guess what I was trying to say was just that a textbook that argues that there are more slaves now than there are today, without saying that, for instance, there are way fewer proponents of slavery, would also be a biased textbook.
Well, yeah, I mean, so like that is a good point. If I were to write this as a book, I mean, I think in the slavery section, I would it's a good point, it's an accurate point. But if I were to write the slavery section, I'm pretty sure I'd mention that there's an anti-slavery movement today as well, that sort of thing. You know, some of these questions, though, like the one time I've ever asked a group, it happened to be adult males, how they actually felt about slavery, absent from conventional morality. But like, if we changed our policy so that people we defeated in war would be forced to work in the United States for 30 years or something, would you support that? I don't claim that this data is representative, but about 65% of them said, yeah, I'd have no problem with that. And I see a couple of people nodding. I don't think most people would have any particular problem enslaving battle captives as opposed to shooting them. You know, so I don't actually know if we are more opposed to slavery than we have been at any previous time. There were Athenian arguments against slavery. Nagarjuna, I believe, the Buddhist philosopher, spoke out against slavery, although he mostly argued for the gentler treating of slaves. Aristotle, on the other hand, argued for slavery. You know, the tool that talks needs to be fed, but you can beat it. You know, the significant pro-emancipatory movement in the United States in the 1800s. But I mean, now we're kind of getting into the weeds here. Your point was a good point. Yes. Yeah. It's always a good idea to check what you say, definitely. Sir, last one.
Oh, so I appreciate you pointing out the importance of restoring facts to conversations, but I'm wondering if by focusing on factual inaccuracies of claims, you're missing important wisdom or kernels of truth, even if they're small, that position has. For instance, as we heard at the beginning, hate crime rates, sorry, I just misspoke. Hate crime rates have increased recently, unless the FBI is lying to us. Maybe that's the case now. But pointing out that there's some inaccuracy in the rhetoric about that doesn't change the fact that we should probably be addressing the hate crimes that do occur.
I think there are two levels to that. I'm going to write both these down. At the first level, I mean, when you say, well, there's some kernels of truth even in the narrative of the Black Lives Matter guys and the dissidents going back and forth, that part, the second part, I basically agree with. The first part, I don't believe in poetic truth. I'm a boring statistician. Like, if someone says, like, we saw this a lot with George Floyd, where people said, like, a man was murdered, as happens so often, as reminds us of Emmett Till and the strange fruit swinging from southern, like, my reaction to this is kind of cut the bull. Like, it's unfortunate that this guy died in this encounter with police. I think it would have been hard to prove murder too in that case, speaking of someone who trained as a lawyer, but you know, that's not ideal policing, take him to court. But does that represent some deep failing of the Western world, the USA and Britain and Ireland? No, not at all. So I don't think the poetic truth, like the used angle, Matthew Shepard comes up in this context in the gay rights space. I have a sort of speak not ill of the dead policy. I mean, like, so I'm not gonna unpack each one of these cases, but like a lot of those held up to the light. People should have certainly done some jail time, but we're not really looking at martyrdom. Jacob Blake, probably the second most famous Black Lives Matter martyr after Mr. Floyd, was literally a rapist who went back to his victim's house and tried to steal her car. So he was attempting to drive off in her vehicle with a couple kids in it. When he got into a physical fight with an officer, the officer pulls a service weapon and shoots him 7 times. Again, you can argue for prosecuting excessive force in that one case, although I wouldn't. I just want to drop that under the circumstances. But can you say that this means something about American police officers? They're hunting rapists to the end of the world. I mean, I don't think you can. The second point is actually legitimate. Most of these points aren't actually; they're actually just quite valid. But you know, if you're looking at something, so for example, if in hate crime hoax I find that almost 20% of these high-profile hate incidents, or all the hate incidents, more than that of the high profiles, are fake, do you write that book knowing that there actually is hate crime, and maybe more to the point, there actually is racial violence, there actually is sexual assault, knowing that there are people that are going to use that to present a false image of skepticism about it? I think the answer is yeah, because it's extremely relevant that a quarter of the cases aren't real. Like, if you're a police detective, you need to know that, or you're going to sentence a very large number of innocent people to jail. Yeah, so I mean, you definitely present that information, and throughout the book, I actually kind of, and again, maybe something you do better on in your talks, like I and many other people are, you know, shouty, charismatic, in a public speaking appearance, whereas you're not in an academic journal article. But in the book itself, I mean, that point's made consistently, like X% of sexual assault claims are real, X% of, you know, racial violence claims are real. Like if someone, gets their ass kicked outside a country bar at 4 a.m., like that happened. There's a category of offenses, though, where people are saying things like, Jussie Smollett claimed that he walked through the Young Executive neighborhood in Chicago at 2 in the morning. This neighborhood's 10% black, 10% gay, 87% Hillary Clinton voters, and he was set upon by 2 brutes that he was able to beat back as just a tough guy, and so on. And I mean, when that comes up, you can't say, oh, well, that surely happened, just to enforce a narrative, because you end up looking like a fool. Now, a third point, kind of down the middle, when you have hard data like you just presented, another question would be the validity of the data. So the FBI hate crime data actually is really bad. The FBI has gotten into this problem recently where and because Donald Trump has said this, a lot of academics aren't really going to note this point. But like one of the reasons that you often get insane figures for the African American crime rate is that it's usually taken from what's called the FBI UCR. That's the Uniform Crime Report from the FIBIs, the FBI. There's a better crime data source that comes from basically the census called the BJS and CVS, blah, blah, blah. But the problem with the FBI crime report is that most people don't report to it. There's a long, complicated document you have to fill out to send in all the statistics from your police department over the course of a year, which could make your department look like a bunch of ignorant hacks. So you're basically putting out all this work for nothing. So in the UCR, like one thing I found out, and anyone academics watching are free to challenge me on this, but one thing I found out is that poor white departments almost never report. So I mean, like if you're looking at why there's a big difference in African American crime totals over here versus over here, it's because the areas that have poor and violent white guys aren't going to contribute over here, generally speaking, much of the time. So when you see something like a couple of years ago, the FBI reporting rate in what's called NIBRS, their new UCR system, dropped to around 60%, and that's number of towns, not number of people. It's now back up to normal. It's now back up to around 90, which also isn't that good. But like you'd have to look at what year that's coming from, so on. The one time I took a look at the FBI data just on hate crimes, it was, I think, 2021, because someone made this challenge to the book, and like you want to respond to it, you want to be sincere about it. And the argument was that hate crimes had increased by 1,500. But the first thing that I found was that reporting departments, like the number of departments that actually reported in, had increased by 1,000. So each department would have had to report 1.5 hate crimes to account for that difference. And I mentioned that to the guy who pointed this out, and he and I said, we should break this down across all 1,000 small cities, and that did not happen. But I mean, I would be skeptical about some of that stuff, where you see these bounces in crime. Same thing with last comment, and I do want to hear if there's a final response from you, but I would apply this to some extent to federal same-year data usually, just as a data point, where so like the Biden administration will say we created X number of jobs. And then 6 months later, after the fiscal year ends, these usually end in July, they'll say, sorry, we overestimated by 880,000. I mean, this just happened. So I mean, Trump was just as bad with this. But I am not sure. I wouldn't be surprised if hate crimes have increased by 1,000 or 2,000, just given the level of racial tensions. And yeah, that is something to note. But I do think that data source has a lot of issues. And at the broader poetic point, like until you can prove the validity of the data, so on. No, I don't think one case involving, say, an abused lesbian woman or something that really says much about the country. You'd have to show the context. But that's a qualitative, quantitative thing, right? Other people would disagree.